right, give it up for Carly.
Hello, everybody. It's lovely to see you all. Hi, my name is Carly. I am a developer advocate at HalfStack, but I haven't always been. And actually, my experience working in banking is the reason I've got a little bit of a bugbear about data grids, which you can probably guess from the title of this talk. So what am I going to talk about today? Well, I'm going to talk about the reasons why I've had this bugbear develop over 10 years working in banking. I'm also going to try and introduce data visualization in a less scary way by talking through some frameworks and some patterns to help demystify some of the design practices for why to pick which visualization. Most of the examples will be based on React, but I'll also interject with other frameworks that you might want to try. And if you want to ask any questions, feel free to catch me afterwards. I'm more than happy to chat through. Okay, so as I said, I just moved into being a developer advocate, but before that, I spent 10 years in a big, large investment bank. And I did a lot of stuff. I wore loads of different hats, like many of us within any industry, but I guess particularly IT and technology, we tend to try out different things to try and figure out where our place is, where we feel like we're authentically, in the right spot. And front end has always been my happy place because I just like the little bit of creative flair that you can exhibit there. I think we can all agree it's, I know there's all these debates about whether coding is creative, but when you can see something, it's pretty creative, right? Thank you. Cool. But you know what? As I've progressed in my career, I've found that I ended up I actually knew things that I could impart, shock horror, to help, my colleagues and my friends, and none more particular when we had a bit of an explosion of demand. Everyone wanted to build dashboards. It was like the new buzzword of the century was dashboards. So we didn't have a lot of front-end engineers. So what ended up happening? Well, that's when people start to kind of progress through. They'll move forward. They'll start, dusting off the JavaScript after spending years of writing Java services and try and get into this world of building screens and talking to users and trying to build features in agile delivery teams. And that's all great, but as I was helping my colleagues and my friends, I was starting to feel a lot of really heavy deja vu. Because I'm a front-end engineer, I am not a designer, you pick up things as you go along. But what I was finding was people thought I had the keen design eye and I could review or give them some feedback on their screens to what they look like and say, yeah, this is great, which was normally kind of code for, can you just check my CSS to make sure this looks okay? But there was a little bit more to it. But this deja vu was really starting to give me a little bit of fear and a bit of a headache because I was always seeing a screen that looked like this. Every single time. You can see where the title's coming from, right? Every single time, every screen that every developer was building and wanting to get my keen design eye on always had drop-downs at the top. Now, drop-downs and different controls are fab. They are a good way for narrowing down the data that's coming back from the server or giving a bit more of a feel for users that they've got some control over the data coming back. But sadly, what would happen is, unless the user had been there before the first time, this was to select all, and it would just return everything. Which is where we come to the next problem. They were always using a data grid, or at least one. I did see a few screens that had more than one grid, sorry. But the fact of the matter was, they were always using grids. It didn't matter about the high volumes of data we were dealing with. Remember, this is banking, so we're going to have high volumes in a lot of cases. There was always going to be these huge grids, potentially with an extremely large number of columns. I've seen ones that have 30-minute 30-minute windows for each column throughout the day. If you want to do the math, that's a lot of columns. And they'll have a lot of rows and they'll have a lot of pagination, which can be a bit scary to try and start and figure out, what you're meant to do. But they always had a gotcha just in case, where you would be able to export it to your friendly spreadsheet application of choice, namely Microsoft Excel, because everyone was using Windows. So I would start asking some questions. It's a bit scary to say, but I would want to know more about what our users were trying to do. Like, what are they trying to achieve? What's their objective? What are they sitting at the desk trying to do with your app? And quite often we'd start talking about the behaviour of a user, how they're clicking on the screen. Okay, that's great, but what are they actually trying to do? So we'd go off and we'd have a chat with some users and we'd figure out what was going on. And they were always exporting it out, and then they were translating that data into something else, aka a visualization or some summary level statistics that they'd extracted from pivoting it. They'd always translate it into something else. And for a long time I was actually, I hate to say this, a little bit judgmental, because I would always wonder, well, why didn't we build that bit? Mainly because I wanted to geek out and build visualizations, sadly, but there was other ideas around there too. But actually, you know what? People were just trying to do the right thing. They were trying to do their jobs and trying to do it in the right way to give the user what they wanted. But it's not always what the user needs. And sadly, I kind of found some reasons that would appear, particularly in these Java engineers, of why we ended up always building a data grid. The first reason, which is not going to surprise anyone, has anyone worked in banking or any financial related? Yeah. Do you think your users love spreadsheets? Yeah, thank you. That was my experience too. Users love spreadsheets in banking. I am assuming in a lot of other domains they probably do, but they do love spreadsheets. They're everywhere. And fact of the matter is that often we are building, new software that is based on existing processes that's all sitting in spreadsheets. But let's take a moment to understand why they use a spreadsheet, because you know what, actually, we should appreciate it for a moment in terms of the design and the capabilities it gives. These spreadsheet applications are intuitive and easy to use. They've been sitting on their desktop since their first day of work. These people know how to use it. They know how to get the answers they need quickly when someone is kind of pushing them for results or breathing down their neck. And it's got this rich array of data capabilities that makes getting the answers easy. And what we've done effectively by using data grids a lot of the time is we've kind of done an extension of Jacob's Law. Has anyone in the room heard of Jacob's Law, the design? No worries. So Jacob's Law is one of the key laws of UX. If you just Google for laws of UX, there's a wonderful site that explains all of them. But you know about Jacob's Law if you're building front-end apps without realizing it, because all Jacob's Law basically states is that users will expect your application to work and behave in the same way as the other apps that they've used before. Which makes perfect sense, right? We do this without thinking about it. We used hamburger menus for years for the exact same reason, because everybody else was doing it. And therefore our users had a nice warm fuzzy feeling that they could take one look at our app and know that's what we were intending for them to do. The second reason is that sometimes data visualization gets a bit of a bad rep because there are some wonderful yet slightly complicated libraries out there. Has anyone used D3GS at all? How did you find it to learn? Everyone seems to have the same reaction, but I've got to commend you for actually trying. I tried to build a heat map one day on a day off for fun, and I gave up very quickly and ended up resorting to my favorite shortcut libraries. The reality is that if we're talking about people getting into data visualization, libraries with a high learning overhead, such as D3, are scary. If you've got time deadlines, you are most likely not going to want to invest the time to try and use it. So we can get this really bad reputation that building data visualizations is hard and that we can't do it. And I'm hopefully going to bust that today by giving you some shortcuts. But the last reason that I want to talk about, which might seem a bit meta, is every single person who's building software today has an opinion about the applications that we build. Has anybody seen this cartoon before? No? It's cool. So it's from a book called Don't Make Me Think by Steve Krug. I do recommend it. It's an oldie, but it's a goodie. It's been updated for web, but it has some really nice, simple ideas about usability and design that I like. And you can also read it reasonably quickly because it's short. Hey. But I've had so many discussions like this in my career. So for anyone towards the back maybe struggling to see, basically the cartoon is outlining people having a discussion about the types of controls to use. And you've got Bob here down in the corner saying, people don't like pull downs and expressing opinion that we shouldn't use a pull down for this case because they hate it. We have, favorite controls that we use all the time. We have controls that we hate and actively avoid because of our own experiences, because of how Jacob's law works. For that reason, I would end up having situations where people would say, well, I don't like visualizations because of this particular situation where it didn't work out. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't experiment and try. So in my instance, we need to kind of debunk some of our assumptions here. Let's break down some of our own design opinions and see if it works for this use case. And sadly, I care about this because I feel like for a lot of us, kind of over the last few years, we're kind of getting a bit information overloaded out. Because the reality is that we are surrounded by data all the time. It's not just when we go to work every day. We've got it on the tube and the way in when our phone is kind of pushing notification after notification on us. Get the same thing in the evening when we come home with our emails. And we're producing more data. So I pulled out this stat from the IDC. I think it was published last year. And they are estimating that by the year 2025, that 480 exabytes of data is going to be produced daily by the year 2025. Now, I hope no one's going to try and render all of that in a data grid. I think we've got some common sense, even with my bugbear. But the fact of the matter is, we need to try and think about how to introduce data at the right time to prevent burnout, to promote well-being of our users who are using the applications we build every day. So let's exercise some of that care. So let's try and see if there's some ideas of visualizations that might work for us. I know that it can be scary. I know that if we are just diving in data services all day, the idea of coming out to the front end and building visualizations can leave us a bit stuck because we might not have the keen design eye that everyone thinks Carly had. But that's why I'm here to help. So I'm going to walk through some code examples and mention some libraries that I've found useful for building different visualizations and map them to particular kind of heuristics so that you might have the next time an idea of which might be the most useful control. Now, I'm going to cover a few. I have a few more. If you scan the GitHub QR code, or if you want to come and have a look afterwards, I've basically put loads of different visualizations and examples, but we're going to cover 3 main ones today. So the first one is a user behavior that, as you can imagine with people using spreadsheets, for those who were talking about before, you'll have seen it a lot. They'll put default sorting on columns. Now, I've seen this a lot because normally they would say to me, well, I'm only really interested in the top 5 of the top 10. Which is a great question of, so why do you need those hundreds of records that we're returning to you? The reality is that these extremes of data are interesting because if they change, that's normally the first point of call to try and figure out what's different, particularly if you're dealing with industries such as banking or e-commerce. If one particular product is selling well, you want to know about it. If it suddenly dropped out the top 10 a few days later, you want to know about that too. And normally, if they're doing it on counts and values, I've found that they're clearly searching for the maximum in this data. So that's why they push it to the top or the bottom. So why don't we just use a bar or a column chart instead? So I've got an example here. It's written using Recharts. It's really simple to get started with. I had next to no buggers with it, which was nice. The styling, to be honest, the dark theme styling was a bit more of a challenge, but everything else seemed to work out okay. We're going to walk through the code. It might be a bit small, but we'll try. And if anyone wants to dig through the code later, feel free. But the things that you're going to start seeing when you start working with data visualizations is, firstly, we do need to think about sizing and responsiveness. Not just because we're living in the age of multi-device, but also because sometimes the analyst downstairs is not going to have the same shiny monitor as you. I actually have a really bad story where I was given an extra small monitor because our users had been kept on the old monitor size and the developer's been given the new one, and we were having issues with trying to resize things. I know this sounds really strange. It kind of predates when you could do funky sizing stuff in the Chrome developer tools. So I ended up getting an extra small monitor just for that, which is really sad. What I should have done is just made my stuff responsive, but I was learning. And what you do here for Recharts is you need to wrap it in a responsive container. Some will do it out the box, but that's something to look for when you're checking into the docs. The data is actually just an array of objects, and then the way that it works is that you have these data key elements, which you might be able to see hanging about here. And that's basically denoting the property. So the x-axis, then the bars are going to pull through those values basically for rendering your chart. You should put some other things on to make them usable. So the Cartesian grid is basically putting a grid on the top. Now, I find these quite good for allowing it to fall over, particularly if you're looking for kind of smaller values in your columns. So it's an optional thing, but it's definitely worth having a think about. Make sure to put things like tooltips and legends on there to make it easy to discriminate between values and series. And then also think about your stacking options. Whenever I speak to people about stacking things one on top of the other, they just think it's about saving space. But the reality is it's actually a quite nice tool for showing relationships or related things. So here what I've done actually is I've got two different categories of rubber band. You know, Wile E. Coyote's gone a bit nuts buying all the rubber bands, but it's really useful to be able to compare against other products that are not related, such as anvils, if you group them together. So it's definitely worth not thinking about it as a one or the other kind of thing. Now, as you can imagine, working in banking, I did have to deal with a lot of time data. And time data in grids just, I'm sorry, it doesn't work. That example is true that I talked about with the columns for each of the 30-minute intervals throughout the day. That is not easy to try and figure out activity and what's going on. You need to have a visualization for that. Now, I'm going to walk through two examples for this one, just to show how there's a slight difference when you start getting into kind of different framework support. So this one here is written in Highcharts, and the reason I put this one up is because Highcharts has a really nice zoom feature, which you can see running through behind me. And it works out the box with some simple configuration. You don't have to write the transforms for you. This other example I have is Elastic Charts. Now, obviously, Elastic Charts is used heavily in Kibana, so obviously it works well for time series as well, which is why I've included it in. Highcharts is, I wouldn't want to say framework agnostic. It has support and wrappers for each of the key frameworks, and it also works with vanilla JavaScript. But then obviously for Elastic, it is React specific. So just a note there for anyone thinking about including it in particular projects. So we'll do a quick note of the code. So here is the Highcharts code. The biggest thing I want to call out is we need to tell it that it's dealing with a date time series. Otherwise, it's going to think you just might be dealing with some really, really, really big numbers on your axis. The representation of the data series is actually got the time representation in milliseconds. That is your time. And then you have your appropriate value to be rendered as the point on the Y. You'll then add in your plot options. So that's where things like those legends and tooltips that we talked about in the Recharts example are going to live. Obviously, check out the documentation to see what's going on there. And then here's an example of the wrapper in action. So you're going to use the specific React one in this example. Other frameworks are available with wrappers too. And then obviously you'll pass in the appropriate options. Now I'm going to move on to the Elastic one, which is more of a React kind of feeling one. And what you'll see is that some have the idea of a theme. Highcharts does have this too. So you might have the situation where, depending on the kind of state of your app, that you'll probably have to pass in the theme. So that line 15 there will help you out. You'll also see I've got my series defined. The data is actually represented at the top in the same fashion. It's that millisecond representation. And that works quite well. If I go back to Highcharts, if you have any missing data points, it means that Highcharts is actually smart enough to figure that out and can show as gaps. There's some examples on their docs on how to do that. And then you'll see that I've got the X scale type on line 22 just here. And obviously that is set as time because we're going to be dealing with a time series here. Simples. The third case where, I'm sorry, grids just don't work is showcasing data with relationships in it. I've seen people try to do it in different ways, and for me, it just makes it really difficult to figure out which are the prominent relationships within your data set. The easiest way to do this is have basically your source or your kind of, first level of your relationship as one column and the second as the other. But people try to do it in different ways. So this example here shows grouping. in AG Grid. So what you can do is you can have basically your recipient kind of parent, and then obviously Wiley is sending gift cards to all of these kind of underlyings. That's kind of the idea of the data set in here. But that doesn't really make sense because this column here says recipient, and he's not a recipient, yet he's still sitting in that column. There's other ways to do this where you have something called master detail, where you basically pop a mini grid within a grid out, which can get really trippy. But to be honest, there's some problems with that. If we want to see relationships going the other way, if we want to determine which are the most prominent ones in terms of volume, it's really difficult to see within this data grid what's going on. So you need to start getting into those visualizations that people say are scary and that you need to build in D3. And I'm glad to say that you don't have to if you have a dig around and find the right framework and the right library. So this example here is written in Nivo, and it's actually for React. Highcharts does have a chord example as well, and just have a look through. So the reason I like the chord is that it solves some of those problems that I just talked about. So if you can see from the screen, it's really easy to tell using the arcs on the outside what is exactly, you know, the main kind of event, who's doing the most activity of all your categorized customers in this case. But I can also see via all the different ribbons exactly which relationships are going where. And I can also see this really weird anomaly here where Bugs Bunny is buying really a lot of gift cards for himself. I'm not sure why, but you can see things like that. You can see these different types of relationships. And this is just one of a couple of alternates. If you think that you've got kind of multi-level relationships, you can try what's called a Sankey, which in plain terms is just this flattened out, but the ribbons can connect to each other. Or you can even, if anyone's from a maths or computer science background, has nightmares about topology class or Dijkstra algorithms, I'm seeing some smiles, so we're all there. You can also use this idea of network, which is basically directed graphs, so you can do things like that as well. So, the Nivo code, what does it look like? Well, first things first, it's worth noting that this is a responsive chord out the box, so it doesn't have this container idea that we saw in Recharts before. You'll see here that I've got all my categories as keys, and then my data is basically a matrix. So just to try and explain this a little bit, you'll see that Wile E. Coyote effectively here is sending that 650 to himself because this is position 0, 0 in our matrix. And then he's sending to Roadrunner the position at 0, 1, which is that 285 that's sitting there. There are some kind of settings and angles that you might want to set, which is kind of what puts people off with D3. But it's pad angle, inner radius ratio, and inner radius offset. The docs and the examples are actually really good for Nivo, so I actually just took what was there. But you can tweak it based on your artistic eye, because we all have a little bit of that, even if we've not got the keen design eye of Carly. And the other thing that we should probably note about as well is sometimes you need to get to a situation where your tooltip needs more information. In this case, I've overridden it because I want to see both sides of the relationship. So all I've done here is I've specified each of my kind of elements one after the other. And what you'll see from the code is that I've got the source and the target covered in there. Okay. So from the title and from the, 20 minutes I've spent moaning about data grids and talking about visualizations, you're probably thinking, so do you never use a data grid? Like, is there really a valid reason to use it? So, you know what? We need to come from a more balanced place. Sometimes we do have to use a data grid. And I've found two situations that kind of I find work a little bit better and help with that information overload concern that's really driving the problem I'm talking about. So the first thing is I talked a lot about how my users would export the data out and then pivot it. So why is the pivot in Excel or Google Sheets or whatever it is? Why isn't it in my application? In some domains, it can be a bit of a problem when people take data out of the application. There can be audit or risk concerns. And the fact of the matter is, if you have the pivot within your application, there's a more auditable presence there compared to an Excel spreadsheet. But it also means that you can do cool stuff. It's far more easier to share a URL with the favorite selection of what they've put into the application. It's far easier to get insights into the types of reports they're generating as well. So why don't we just put it in there? It does get into a tricky situation. So this AG Grid example, it is an enterprise feature. But there's other libraries you can check out, like Pivot Table JS and things, which can obviously help you with that. And then the last thing I've noticed that no one ever told me that it had to be one or the other. And I had lots of debates about this, but I think if we're going to build better experiences, we need to allow people to get an idea and then go through and see the detail. And that's exactly what's happening in this animation that you can see. So as I'm clicking on the particular data points in the charts that I've got towards the top, you'll see underneath that the data within the viewport of the grid is actually changing. So let's use our charts and the click events as a filter mechanism. It tends to work quite well. So how do I do this? Well, most charts, if not all, I'm struggling to find one that has some form of click event that you can basically pass in a callback function to do whatever you please. So here I've purposely called out the Nivo one because there's actually 2 points in the chart that you can click and handle differently. There's the arcs around the outside, and then there's the ribbons through the middle as well. So think about that carefully when you're thinking about which events to handle. Whoops. Hey. Obviously, depending on the chart library you're using, you have different types of events. So here I've got a selection. So you see the Highcharts one on line number 17. Basically, we're pulling out the series name for the element I need. It's the source ID of the ribbon, and then for the arc, it's just the ID itself because I've not got 2 ribbons to worry about. And then, of course, this is a React app. Other frameworks are available and will handle state differently. But what you can do is basically update your state and then pass that down into your data grid. And then for the data grid, well, what you need to do is when you receive that update, you're going to need to apply that selection in the filter. So get the instance of the filter via the API, then update the state of the model to include the elements of the selection, noting carefully if it is a single or multi-select, because obviously you don't want to pass in stuff that doesn't quite fit the contract. And then at the bottom in the line 35, what you'll see is that basically you call the onFilter changed event, and that will update the data that's in the viewport. Okay, so we've talked about a lot today. I've shared a little bit about my bugbear of data grids based on my banking experience, which I hope is relevant for other domains as well. I've talked about why it happens, that it comes from innocent places, and we've talked about visualizations so that anyone who doesn't want to start digging into the complexities of D3 can go to a happier place to get started. But I want to leave you with a message to experiment and to try things out. We can get really stuck in those patterns of using the same controls over and over and over again. And sometimes it's worth taking a step back, trying something out and seeing if it will work better for this case that we've got in front of us. So I'm hoping this has inspired people to do some cool visualizations. If you do, please do share them with me. I'd love to see what you come up with. But there's also these other inspirational resources that I found useful, and they're good for advanced topics and understanding as well. So there's a couple of books listed up there. Data Sketches by Nadia Bremer and Shirley Wu, which is really nice because it starts from the initial sketch, showing what they actually wanted to do, and then talks through the different tools and libraries they've used to get to the end and what challenges and if they had to tweak the design. So that's really fun. Information is Beautiful has really advanced visualizations, but it's got some nice ideas on things like labeling and stuff. You can check out his website as well. It's one of those kind of coffee table books. So if you don't want to buy the book, you can also check out the site. The D3 Graph Gallery, even if you're not using D3, they have some really wonderful descriptions of when one visualization is good for a particular use case. The Big Bad World with information everywhere is full of visualizations too, so check out websites. Newspapers are doing a lot of infographics and things like that as well. And if you want to grab links to any of those resources and any of the code samples I talked through today, along with a few other ones like maps and stuff, do check out the QR code and you can get all of it. Or if you don't catch it, come and see me afterwards and we can chat. So thank you very much, everybody. And if you have any questions, just come and find me. Thanks.